Hi there guys, and welcome to another episode of the Cover Zero show with me, your host Simon Conboy. Carrying on with the season preview series, today's episode will be focusing on the Seattle Seahawks. Now, for those of you who haven't seen one of these episodes before, I will be breaking down my projected offensive and defensive starters. Of course, there is the opportunity for this to change somewhat with pre-season being underway. However, I suspect this will probably be a fairly good representation of where the team will be early September. I'll then be going through the team's schedule, just sort of loosely highlighting what I believe to be the key areas of the schedule to navigate in order for this team to make it back to the playoffs, before giving the three key areas, in my opinion, if this team is going to have a greater level of success this season, particularly if they do reach the playoffs. They've got some areas I think need to be improved. So we'll hop right in with the offensive starters. Of course, at quarterback, Russel Wilson, who truly does look like one of the young franchise QBs in this league. Last year, thoroughly convincing for me. This team was an absolute mess offensively, to be honest. The lack of run game and the offensive line struggles led to offense being hard to come by. Russell Wilson did a fantastic job playing banged up, playing with fairly little support around him. Managed to drag this team to some wins. He's got a good arm, he's an accurate thrower, and he is really incredibly elusive. Doesn't make too many mistakes. He's just a tough quarterback to beat. Doesn't put his team in bad positions. At the running back position, I'm slightly dubious about this, but I've got Eddie Lacy listed as the starter at the moment. I just think he matches what they were doing with Marshawn Lynch, and I think they want to replicate that. Wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't see the field too much, to be honest. Thomas Rawls has a lot of talent. He's just not been able to put it together over the course of a whole season, and CJ Prosise is certainly going to have a role. I've not got him listed, but he looked impressive last year. He'll certainly give them a dynamic weapon in the passing game, and I think he's certainly got a bit more pop and shift to him than Lacy or Rawls. In all, it's a pretty good stable of backs. If this team can run block better, I think they'll be very productive in that aspect of the game. The wide receiver position, Doug Baldwin, one of the most underrated players in the league. He's been a great option for this team for a few years now. Him and Wilson have a really good understanding. He's great after the catch. Doesn't drop too many. And they've got really good chemistry that makes them such an effective pair. Jermaine Kearse will likely be the number 2. Need to see a bit more consistency from him. And Tyler Lockett, once he's back from the injury that he suffered in the playoffs, he gives them a deep threat, and a legitimate deep threat at that. I expect to see him playing a similar role to guys like Ted Ginn have been over the last few seasons. Not a bad group. Not the most dynamic, but Wilson makes it work. The tight end position, Jimmy Graham, looked healthier last year. I think him and Wilson are slowly starting to develop a chemistry between each other. It's not been the quickest process, but last year saw some glimpses of what Graham had been previously in New Orleans, and we know when he's at his best, he's one of the top receiving players at the position. A great athlete, superb body control, and a great catch radius. If he can really step it up, then that will be a massive boost for this passing attack. Now on to what is one of the most concerning units in the league. I mean, last year they were the primary culprit behind this team's struggles, and it doesn't look like it's got a huge amount better. Offensive tackle, I mean, you can probably throw Luke Jokel into this as well. He might be in contention for one of these spots, but at the minute, George Fant and Jermaine Ifedi are listed as projected starters. I really do feel like these are positions that should be wide open in training camp based on their performance last season. Ifedi is a young player. He's got some talent. You could see him step up potentially. Not sure about him in pass protection, especially at this point. Not sure it helps the issues that are around him. And George Fant's someone I'm not particularly familiar with. As I say, these positions could be wide open. Either guy could be on the left, the right. I've really got no idea how this group is going to look. At guard, I've currently got Luke Jokel listed, along with Mark Glowinski. Again, besides just throwing a dartboard at random names at the moment, when I look at this group, that really is shocking amount of talent. Probably at centre, Justin Britt might be their most talented player at this point. So, and even then, it's hard to judge. Again, the struggles last year, it's hard to single out any one person as being the cause of those issues, but it's also hard to single out too many of the players for praise. So he's going to have to try and hold this group together. I'm sure it's going to look like a patchwork scattershot group once again. And we'll just have to see if they can be a bit more productive. And at kicker, Blair Walsh, who's got a monster leg, just got to put it together. Some of these young kickers with a lot of talent have been really struggling these last couple of years. So, this offense, it's hard to imagine them being immensely productive. I mean, they probably won't have to be. I expect the defense, spoiler alert, to be really good again this year. But the issues along the offensive front are going to just threaten to sink this team again. There were times last year where the rest of the skill positions, Wilson, the running game, just didn't have a chance. There were guys in the backfield all day long. I think to the first game of the season against Miami, who could pass rush. The Bucks later on in the season, the game against Arizona ended 6-6. It was just impossible to play offense, and they've not done enough to convince me that's not going to be the case. It will help that Wilson should be healthier. He'll be a bit more mobile, but I don't know if you can rely on that as much as this team may well have to. So I'm concerned. If the pass protection's there, then I expect them if the line plays there, I like the talent. Wilson will be productive, that. There's some Doug Baldwin and Graham are top end talents. The running back group's good. But as things are, I just think this is going to be an underachieving group based on those struggles. It may sound like I'm being a bit over dramatic with it, but they were that bad last year. Moving on to the defensive side of the ball, if you've got to think of one dominant defense that will define this era, it is probably the Seahawks of the last few years. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is the defensive end combination of Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. They return. Bennett's a very good all-round player, versatile, plays the run and the pass very well, one of the best defensive linemen in all of the league. It's just hard to come up with criticism from him. He's great on the edge. You can put him inside. He'll do a great job for you. Doesn't get enormous sack numbers, but constantly making plays. Cliff Averill, somewhat the opposite. He's a speed rusher, but they're hard to find in today's game, and he's certainly a productive one. These two, once again, will be bringing heat off the edge. It's a good pair. They've got some depth at that position. However, defensive tackle is a bit of a concern for me. They've got Ataiba Rubin, who's a very experienced player, and Jerome Reed, who's far less so. They've got the size to be a really good player of run pluggers, but I think they're going to suffer somewhat in just not having any pass rush with these two guys in there. And they didn't play as well as you'd think against the run last year, considering their size. There's a reason they went for Malik McDowell in round 2. There were questions about him, but he's more talented than these two guys are. Unfortunately, it looks like they're going to lose him for the season. It's not an enormous weakness, but on such a talented group, it does stand out as a bit of an issue, and I also worry a bit about the depth there. It may not be the strongest rotation. The outside linebacker position, KJ Wright, one of those players who's been a big contributor to the success of this team. Just flies a bit under the radar. There are a lot of big names on this team. And Cassius Marsh is the guy I've got listed at the moment. Like in a lot of teams, I think the third linebacker spot's pretty open. Most teams tend not to invest highly in that third backer in the 4-3 these days. They are essentially sub-package players. But KJ Wright's a very good player. Like most of the Seahawks players, he plays the pass very well, but he's also a willing tackler. And he's got a lot of help with middle linebacker Bobby Wagner, who was stellar once again last season. He's developed into one of the best defensive players in football. A great caller of the game. Does a fantastic job getting this group organised. And he plays a ferocious brand of football. He's a real thumper. But he's also exceptional in coverage. He's gotten better in coverage with every year. And I think at this point, you can make an argument that him and Kuechly are the two best backers in the league. The fact there's competition there, considering what Kuechly's done, says a lot about how swiftly Wagner's improved. He is such an important player to this team. Just expect to see him absolutely stuff the stat sheet again this year. The cornerback position is not quite as loaded as it has been, but you've still got Richard Sherman there, even amidst the trade rumours that were thrown around this off-season. Didn't have his best season last year. There were communication issues at times in this secondary. I think some of the safeties missing time in Earl Thomas and some of the games Chancellor missed did not help things. And I think Sherman was also just maybe exposed as a little by some of the faster guys in the league. He's not a burner by any means, and his physicality has helped him as well as the scheme. And this year, I think we just saw some guys just getting the better of him. Still had an exceptional season. It's just probably not one of the top corners in the league last year. Still got the talent to do it, though. I don't doubt him at all. He's also an absolute asset in the run game. His size, willingness and tackling ability is top notch. Beyond that, Deshaun Shedd and Jeremy Lane, they've got some experience in the scheme. Lane in particular, wouldn't be surprised. This team's done such a good job drafting defensive backs if one of the youngsters steps up and maybe gets into that rotation. But at the end of the day, they've got the two safeties behind them in Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor. This is the heart and soul of this team, these two. Chancellor finally getting a deal. Seemed like a bit of a team-friendly one to me. You could make a legitimate argument for either one of these guys being the best safety in the league, let alone when it comes to the best tandem. There's no doubt it's these two. Earl Thomas is your prototypical free safety. As good a range as anyone in the league. Very, very swift player. Very rarely out of position. Does a superb job. May have some tackles broken in, but remember, he's not the biggest dude. Chancellor, he can play linebacker. He is a big thumper, but he's much better in coverage than you'd think for a guy of his size. And between the two of them, it's an intimidating presence that this team has across the middle of the field. Once again, those two going to be exceptional as long as they stay healthy. And at punter, John Ryan. So, Seahawks last year had a bit of a down season, and again, a lot of that I feel really did go on that offensive line. There was no run game, and Wilson played a lot of the season hurt. This year, though, I do think their record will improve. This schedule is not particularly challenging. I'm not sure there's anyone in the division to truly push them, so I've got them finishing 11-5 this year. The key part of the schedule, really, there's no part that jumps out to me. There's just a lot of games that look pretty winnable. I mean, the toughest stretch they've probably got is just after the bye, where they play against the Giants. That's going to be a tough game. Then the Texans have a good defense. I mean, they could put a lot of pressure on this team, especially considering the issues they've got up front. The Redskins should be solid. And then they're at Arizona, who are going to be if anyone's going to push them for the division, it'll be them. Followed by the Falcons. But even then, if you're going to be a contender, it's not the worst stretch in the world. So when I look at it, I think this team's going to have some surprising defeats, because I just think, when you play a team like the Texans, there's a chance you're just going to lose because your O-line can't protect. But at the end of the day, teams aren't going to score many points on them. They're going to get some wins, and I think they're going to win what's a pretty soft-looking division to make the playoffs. For me, the questions regarding this team in the long run all stem from these three key areas that I've got. Now, normally I do a summary of the defence. However, this group I just think is going to be solid all across the board other than the one area, and that's the defensive tackle spot. As I hinted at earlier, I'm concerned about the lack of any kind of pass rush coming from that group, as well as the lack of depth. I think that might lead to some inconsistencies in the run game. If they can step up and offer production, then this is probably going to be one of the top defences in... Well, I think they'll be one of the top defences in football in spite of that. But if so, they're probably the best unit in the league. You know they're going to do a great job against the pass. They've got the pass rushers. They've got some good linebackers, particularly in coverage, and they've got a great secondary. Those guys are going to have to step up. Again, this will be a top 5 defence. Why I didn't really bring it up earlier. There's just not much to say. They are what they are until I see otherwise. Most of the concerns lie on the offence. Now, if you think back to the Seahawks a few years ago, the offensive line was never great, but it was competent. They could run block, and they gave Wilson enough time to expand plays and at least get some looks down the field every now and then. They've simply got to protect him better. He spent most of last season dinged up. Even in games where he got back healthy, he spent most of them under siege. They've got to allow the runners some space. There are some talented running backs there. I've got no doubt that a lot of the team's problems running the ball over the last few seasons, you had Marshall Lynch getting injured and maybe getting a bit older, but a lot of it stemmed from the offensive line has just really declined, and they can't afford to pay guys. So some of the talented guys that were there aren't anymore, and they just absolutely have to be better. This is the primary issue with this team. It's just why I can't be too high on them, considering how essential solid line play is, particularly once you reach the playoffs. The running back position, though, does have to be better. Rules, they had Rules. He's been inconsistent. He's had some games where he looks like a dominant player, others where he looks a bit hesitant, struggles to really get going. Eddie Lacy's had all kinds of problems in his career with keeping his weight down, so he's a bit of an unknown. I like Procise a lot. How well he'll fit the scheme and how many snaps he'll get is a bit of a question, and of course how healthy he comes back. But if these guys can really form a decent committee, get some of that power run game going that we saw in the heyday when Marshall Lynch was the driving force behind the offense. It's absolutely not been the case the last few years. It has been Russell Wilson's offense. But if they can get a little bit of that back, then I think this team could be very, very dangerous come playoff time. So there you have it. That's your 2017 Seattle Seahawks. Expecting more of the same from them. It's just going to be a question of how far they can get in the playoffs. Do you agree? Let me know, whether it's below in the comment section, the Cover Zero Facebook page. Find me on Twitter at Simon Conboy. Always happy to talk football. And as I always say, if you've enjoyed this, why not check out more of the show? We did our first podcast last week, hoping to have one up this week. We're still figuring out the logistics behind that, so hopefully that will happen. Covered most teams in the league at this point, only 6 more to go. So check some more of those out, and there's plenty of other great stuff up on the channel. If you could like, share, subscribe, check out the Patreon. It's always greatly appreciated. I say it a lot on this show all the time, but I really do appreciate people checking it out. Thank you so much for doing so. It's been a pleasure as always, and go Bucks.